Salveson, who we really appreciate the work that he's done in the past, to an evolving version of the field site. So this group has been game to take on a new challenge and to engage in a similar set of projects, but maybe with a little bit of a different focus. So they're going to present to you today, and following that, we'll have an opportunity for questions. And we appreciate your coming, and I'm going to turn it over to the team.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. We're really excited to present for you today. And so a little overview of our project. This entire semester, we've essentially been assessing the risk of flooding and the potential for mitigation in Chapel Hill Creeks. Just a little overview of what we'll be talking about today. We'll go into some background, explain why we're interested in this topic and why you guys should also be interested in this topic. Some of our GIS analyses looking at the state currently and maybe the future state of flooding in Chapel Hill. Then we'll go into some of our own data that we collected and why it is important and what it means for the future. And then we'll go into some conclusions and hopefully what you guys will take away from our presentation. So I'll hand it over to Ashlyn here.
All right, so to begin our discussion of the work of the past semester, it's super important to kind of talk about the issue at hand and give a little insight on the history. So on the screen pictured above is an image of the Chapel Hill area with an emphasis on the watersheds of Chapel Hill. So to begin talking about Morgan Creek, which is located in the bottom of the picture, it's highlighted throughout the southernmost part of the university. It originates in the western part of Chapel Hill and Prickett's Mountain and flows about 17 miles until it reaches Jordan Lake. And as you can see in the image, it's a major contributor to University Lake, which is used as a drinking supply for both the town of Chapel Hill and Carrboro. Additionally, Morgan Creek runs alongside Finley Golf Course and through the North Carolina Botanical Gardens of Mason Farm Biological Reserve. Transitioning over to Bowling Creek, which runs about 11 miles, it originates in north of Carrboro, and it runs alongside many residential areas as well as some downtown commercial areas in Carrboro. Along with this, Bowling Creek is home to many parks such as Umstead Park, Pritchard Park, and the Chapel Hill Community Center Park. Many UNC students such as myself and Chapel Hill residents make use of these specific trails, as majority of Carolina housing for off-campus is located north of campus near Bowling Creek. Last but not least, Booker Creek is the main waterway that our group decided to focus on for the course of this semester. Booker Creek runs through 5 sub-watersheds and is approximately 6 miles long. It runs along primarily residential and commercial land uses such as East Franklin Street and Fordham Boulevard. So running directly over Booker Creek is Eastgate Shopping Center that was built in 1958. The shopping center was previously home to a grocery store, a bowling alley, and a liquor store. Upon construction, the builders constructed a pipeline that carried the flow of the creek under the passageway of the shopping center. At the time, the effects of climate change had little to no knowledge, especially as the effects have continued to occur at a higher rate than thought before. So now we flash forward to kind of a present day. Eastgate Shopping Center is extremely prone to flooding, which is having extreme environmental, economic, and countless other detrimental impacts on the surrounding areas. So the image on the slide is a depiction of the flooding that occurred at Eastgate Shopping Center on September 17, 2018 during Hurricane Florence. And according to the National Hurricane Service, the frequency of major hurricanes has proceeded to double since the mid-19th century. Hurricane Florence is just one of the many named hurricanes that have had detrimental impacts on the community. And as you can see here, it is impacting people directly. So it's kind of important to kind of highlight a few terms that we'll be using throughout the presentation. So a term that is used frequently when discussing stormwater management in general is a 100-year flood. And a 100-year flood is a flood event that has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. This doesn't necessarily mean that 100-year floods will only happen once in 100 years. In recent years, the frequency of 100-year flood events has increased and is going to increase as climate change progresses. Another vital term to understand is green stormwater infrastructure. Green stormwater infrastructure is a nature-based solution that catches stormwater, infiltrates a part of it into the ground while some evaporates, and while minimal amount continues to drain into the sewer system. It provides benefits to both the environment and the economy by creating more natural stormwater management practices and improved water quality. On the contrary, green infrastructure are structures such as dams, seawalls, roads, and underwater pipelines. These structures are created with little to no consideration of the environment, usually ending up having extreme detrimental impacts, as we can see in Eastgate. Some examples of green stormwater infrastructure are rain gardens, green roofs, bioswales, and wetlands. UNC has begun to take initiative and started implementing some green stormwater infrastructure throughout campus. On the right is Carrington Hall, and on the left is FedEx Building. These are just two of the Carolina buildings that have constructed a portion of their roof to be a vegetated roof system, also known as a green roof. These are used in order to aid in infiltration and evapotranspiration processes that help limit the amount of stormwater runoff while also removing potential pollutants from the water. These are just two examples of the many ways that UNC has begun implementing green infrastructure systems in order to aid in the mitigation of stormwater runoff. So all of which is said so far matters for many reasons. However, I wanted to highlight one of the many reasons why we should care about this topic. One of those reasons being the economic risk of building losses. Flood factor is a site that uses a mathematical calculation that takes into consideration many attributes such as the building size, the use, and the location in order to create a predicted cost for building losses during a variety of annual flood chances, which can be seen on the right-hand side of the screen. One example that really caught my attention was University Mall, which is located a little bit down south of Eastgate Mall, but it certainly feels the effects of both Booker and Bowling Creek during flood events. So after this calculation was done, the website predicted that the mall, which has a 10% chance of flooding this year, has the potential to cost nearly $2.7 million in damages. This is not only an environmental issue, but it is also an economic one. With all of the presented information, the team and I used geographic information system in order to create a set of analyses. In order to make any further analysis regarding the future or potential green infrastructure recommendations, it's important to understand where the current flood risk is. Evaluating and understanding where the current flood risk is vital when making decisions. This is the map of Chapel Hill that shows the blue FEMA flood zones, and the red dots represent population per 10. It is evident that there are less amount of people living near the flood zones. However, it is vital to recognize that there are individuals living in and near the flood zones, majority of those being low income and minorities, which will be present on this slide. So taking an overall look at Chapel Hill, the image on the screen additionally represents the flood zones outlined by FEMA while addressing the various scales of the poverty index. The Chapel Hill area is composed of a mix of various income levels. However, this image depicts that those are considered lower income are more likely to live within a flood zone, thereby feeling the effects more than those that live outside of it. This highlights the importance of saying it is more than where the risk is and who is at risk. It is looking at those that are specifically being impacted. And now I'll pass it on over to Annabelle to talk about the future flood risk that take into consideration the effects of climate change.
Yeah, so I think it's really important that we talk about future flood risk and how climate change is definitely going to impact where our water goes and how much more water we're seeing in our watersheds. So on our map here on the left, this depicts the current 100-year flood hazard area, and it depicts the depth within that. So you can see the darker colors are shallower waters, and then the lighter colors, the greens and the yellows, are going to be deeper flood waters. And this on the left is showing it for the entirety of Orange County, but here on the right, I found these elevations along the outer boundary of the flood hazard area. So this is kind of my process of building this map because it was done completely by my own hands, my own calculations. So I found the elevations along the outer boundary. I then created a layer representing the surface of that water, because if we know the elevation along the edge, we can assume that the water is going to be flat, and so that elevation will continue like across the creeks too. So I found the elevation of the surface of the water. Then I was able to subtract the land elevation from the surface water elevation, and then that gives you the depths that you can see here on the left in the map. And so here we were focusing more on the Booker Creek watershed. So here is it highlighted in pink. And then I clipped that from this original map to give us this map here. So this is just the Booker Creek watershed. You can see a little more differentiation in the floodwater depths here. You can see the yellow and the green. And from the key here on the right, you can see that these depths are measured in meters. So yeah, and with this map, I was able to make some good calculations. And this is Eastgate down here. Wanted to give you that for some reference. So the calculations I did, I first wanted to look at the current volume of water that would be in the watershed for a 100-year flood event. So I was able to calculate that by first taking the pixel size from the previous map that we just showed, and then multiply that by the sum of all of the raster cells. Each pixel is assigned a water depth value. So by summing all of that and multiplying it by the area of a single pixel, we get the current volume of water within the watershed for a 100-year flood event. And then I wanted to know, how is that going to change? So we can predict the increase in water volume for the next 20 years by 2040 by multiplying the area of the Booker Creek watershed, multiply that by the current % impervious surface, and then also multiply that by the expected increase in annual rainfall that the North Carolina Climate Science Report says will occur over the next 20 years by 2040, and that's this number right here. So, and that's assuming that all the runoff goes into the watershed. There is an assumption there, but this is the number I came up with for that. But obviously we are going to develop more, and the amount of impervious surface in the watershed is going to change over the next 18 years. So I just took that into account here with an increased % in impervious surface, which I also got from the North Carolina Climate Science Report. And so this is the final number that we predict will be entering our watershed for a 100-year flood event in 2040. And so to put this into maybe some units that people are more familiar with, this is approximately 150 acre-feet. And to put it in even more perspective, 1 acre-foot is approximately 326,000 gallons. And that's about 150 football fields filled with 1 foot of water. And that's a lot of water entering our watershed. So this is a very important topic. So here's some percentages just outlining that as well. 15.6% increase in floodwater volume for a 100-year flood by 2040, and then 31.3% increase by 2060. And then with that, I was able to create a prediction for how the 100-year flood hazard area is going to change. So the purple here is the flood depth area that I had before for 2022, and the red is where I expect it to change based off of some hard calculations. And so just to see how that is going to dramatically increase, we can look at this zoomed in picture here, and we can see like some places that weren't necessarily affected before are going to be impacted in the next 18 years. So I'm going to hand it over to Gabby now.
So the increase in precipitation, flood frequency, and stormwater events is not the only thing that is changing. It's important to also consider our land cover and land use that has also been changing, which impacts how the water moves through the watershed. So in these maps, we can progress through a few years to see how our land has been developed and been increasingly urbanized, increasing the amount of impervious surface, which of course affects infiltration rates and increases runoff and potential flooding. So beginning here in 1992, you can see the green represents vegetated area, whereas the pink and red areas represent urban areas and impervious surface. So as we move forward in time, you can see that you're losing vegetated area and replacing it with these impervious surfaces, which have implications as we face these increasing stormwater events due to climate change. So with this increasing amount of impervious surface, there's no place for this water to go as we're losing vegetation and available soil for the water to infiltrate. Therefore, this water is now accumulating on the surface and running off and causing flooding and damage to properties and businesses, which is also a problem that we must address. So now we will talk about our data analysis and discussion.
Yeah, so we didn't just find all of our data from GIS sources. We actually did some data collection of our own. We ended up deploying 4 sensors in various locations through Booker Creek, and we'll get into where they specifically were located in the next couple slides. And we didn't just put the sensors in, we also did stream channel profiling where we placed them in the stream. So you can see that in the top right picture a little bit better, where we're measuring the width of the creek, and then along that, we're measuring the depth, so we can do some calculations with that later on. So here is some more in-depth information about where they were specifically located. We have the location and the coordinates, but I think this map here shows better like where they are located, how they're spaced out, where they are in relation to one another. We intended to put out 5 sensors, but because we had issues with one of them being accessible through private property, we ended up not doing that. So we can talk about how that's important a little more later on. But you can see we had the one up here at the outfall of Lake Ellen, upstream of Eastwood Lake, at the outfall of Eastwood Lake, and then one down here by Eastgate Shopping Center, which we're really focused on for this project. So a little bit more about the sensors. There it is in the picture there on the right. They were just water level sensors. They were only taking data about the water level and then recording the date and time that it was recorded for. And it recorded data in 15-minute intervals. Additionally, with that information, we were able to make this lovely Excel sheet down here with a few more data points that just has water pressure, temperature, atmospheric pressure, and water depth. So yeah, so with the water depth presented in that specific Excel file, we were able to make this Excel graph, which has some really nice data on it. Each different line represents a different sensor in a different location. You can see we got some good storm events there at the beginning. They're very prominent. What's really exciting is that the shape of each of the peaks for the different lines really match up in shape quite well. So with that, we were able to calculate the lag time between when the water level changed in one sensor and then when it would subsequently change at one downstream. And that's represented by that bar here. So we looked at the top of the creek at it was the upstream of Eastgate and the outfall of Lake Ellen. That was the difference we were looking at. And we found that it took about 75 minutes for there to be an increase in water level up near Lake Ellen. And for that to also happen, that change in water level to also happen down near Eastgate. And that's really exciting because we can now potentially lay some groundwork to have a flood warning system put in to warn businesses and people in Eastgate that, hey, you might want to put in your floodgates. And that's something really exciting, I think. So move on to Ella.
Yeah, so with this flood warning system, we only ended up having these 4 sensors. So the town of Chapel Hill had tasked us with proposing spots for a new sensor network to go in. So we have 3 main criteria for this sensor network. The first is that we wanted the sensors to be located at the intersection of a road and a stream. We wanted the sensors to be on Chapel Hill property, just because, as Annabelle said earlier, putting a sensor on private property, there was a police officer in this parking lot, and we just kind of didn't really want to mess with anything on private property. So we kind of wanted that to be on Chapel Hill property. And then the third criteria is that we wanted the sensors to be placed within 200 feet of a bridge, underpass, or culvert for easy accessibility. We didn't want anybody having to traipse through the woods for a really long time to get to these sensors. So these are our 3 criteria. So we started off with this base map that just basically shows the rivers and the roads. This is just 3 different views of the same map. This is like the layout I'm going to have for all of the pictures. So this is Eastgate Shopping Center up here. So then I intersected these 2 points. So all of these red triangles are where the stream and road intersects. So that's kind of our first criteria. Okay, cool. We have all of these red triangles. Now let's narrow it down a little bit. The second criteria, Chapel Hill owned property. So this might be greenways, parks. The special down here is just anything that's not included in these other categories. So I then intersected those. So this is the same as the red triangles, but it's just where they intersect on Chapel Hill property, which narrows it down a second time. Our third criteria, I got a map of all of the Department of Transportation structure locations and then added a 200-foot buffer around them. Some of these points are a little bit inaccurate because, as you can see here, the stream running through Eastgate is actually underground. So that's just kind of something that you wouldn't notice when you just have a map of the hydrology in Chapel Hill. It's pretty much impossible to know if these streams are underground or not. So there would have to be kind of an on-foot aspect of going to these spots to actually see, is there a stream here or not? But so this third criteria, this is stream and road intersection in buffer, which is the purple triangles. So these are all of the spots around Chapel Hill that the streams and roads intersect within 200 feet of a culvert or an underpass or something like that. So kind of the holy grail of all of our spots would be these red triangles. There's actually only 3 of them, which is why I kept these other ones in the previous slides open, because I don't think that 3 sensors is really enough. So we have a couple of options to pick from here. And then also these pink dots, these are our current 2022 sensors. So as you can see, we did pretty good job of finding these spots, but we just wanted to make the network a little bit bigger because, as you can see, this only covers a pretty small area of Chapel Hill. So yeah, now I'm going to turn it over to Gabby for her green infrastructure opportunities.
So in coordination with the sensor network, we think it's important for the town of Chapel Hill to consider some opportunities for green infrastructure as mitigation for the increase we're going to see in flood events due to climate change. So I first wanted to narrow down the possibility to place this green infrastructure in the most beneficial places as possible. So some criteria that I used at first to narrow this down is proximity to water bodies or streams, the topography of the area, buildings and streets, where's the impervious surfaces at, and already existing parkland and open space, both at the town, county, and state levels. So obviously that would be very great to put green infrastructure, again, where the town of Chapel Hill has jurisdiction or where they can work at the county level or state level to have these projects incorporated. So moving forward, perhaps the most important aspect I considered with green infrastructure is the soil hydrology. So currently this is the Lower Booker Creek watershed. Our area of interest in this map depicts flood frequency based on soil type. So as you can see, just based on soil type, the blue areas are where there is frequent flooding events compared to the red area where the majority is flood frequency is none. Again, this is based on the soil type. And then another map again is the drainage classification of soil types is also very important when considering green infrastructure. You want to place it in the places where it's most effective infiltration rates are not adequate for these water moving through the watershed. So the darker and lighter yellows are well-drained areas or moderately well-drained areas. And again, you see these places near Lake Eastwood, these lighter blue areas near bodies of water and streams. These are the areas where they have poorly drained soil types. So again, we're seeing a pattern here of these areas where infiltration rates are low, and that's where we're seeing this runoff and flooding. And then a final map is a hydrologic group of soils. Again, these groups are graded based on infiltration rates, which corresponds to runoff. So if they have a high infiltration rate, that means there's a lower chance of runoff because the water is being absorbed into the soil and being stored there instead of running off. However, that we have the majority of the soil types in the Booker Creek watershed being classified as B or D, which is only moderate or very poor infiltration rates. So again, due to this soil hydrology, this is where we're getting all these flooding events because again, due to the increase in impervious surface and just the overall landscape, the water has nowhere to move except onto these impervious surfaces and into people's property and business. So breaking it down to find the best places to put this green infrastructure, I divided it into 3 categories. Green is for green infrastructure. These are the places where multiple criteria overlap and most beneficial to put the green infrastructure. Yellow, there's still some potential. We have less overlapping criteria, but we can still see benefit from the introduction of green infrastructure in these places. And the red is where low priority areas for green infrastructure, we would not see as much benefit in these areas. And then to put us back into perspective for the Eastgate Center, I just wanted to zoom in on this area and then also did an analysis on this. And I just wanted to show, since we are focused on the conflict of flooding in this specific area, that the Eastgate shopping mall also has very good criteria for the inclusion of green infrastructure in this area to mitigate those flooding events that impact that area. So what could this green infrastructure look like? We have bioswales, which redirects water from impervious surfaces like roads into these swales that collect the water and better infiltrate it. It can be aesthetically pleasing by planting vegetation and trees and flowers, and it also provides a buffer between traffic and pedestrians, so it's very multi-use and efficient. Another option would be rain gardens. Again, we have beautification aspect to it, including vegetation again in these impervious and urban areas, and these also double as infiltration systems, again, taking that water, that runoff, and absorbing it into the soil so we do not have that flooding. And these structures also have other benefits, such as attracting local pollinators and improving air quality. And perhaps the most ambitious approach would be daylighting the creek. Obviously, this would be very challenging with current development, but building on top of a stream obviously has provided some complications. So this would be the most efficient and impactful measure that could be considered. So as we go into our conclusions, we really want to show you how this all connects. So due to the increase in precipitation and extreme storm events and flood frequency due to climate change, we are seeing more impact on local residents and businesses due to these flooding events. So we think it is beneficial for the town of Chapel Hill to implement a comprehensive flood network system along with green infrastructure to mitigate these effects, not only for the storm events we are seeing today, but again, as we have shown, the projected increase in these events and the amount of volume of water that will be moving through our watershed in the future. So along with this, in our analysis that we've gotten from our own sensor network, we think this can decrease the flood risk in the Booker Creek watershed, and specifically the Eastgate Shopping Mall Center, by potentially giving a warning to these businesses to take any precautionary measures they may have when a flood event may occur. So just some considerations for our project. In the stable triangle field site, we only had a semester to complete our work. Therefore, we are very limited on time and we're not able to go into every possible topic that is relevant to this issue. There are only 4 of us in this field site, so therefore we were quite understaffed and we're not able to explore different areas of interest and perhaps collect more data, etc. And of course, as Mike mentioned earlier, the Sustainable Triangle Field Site is currently undergoing a redesign as we transfer teaching responsibilities. So this has really been a growing opportunity for both faculty and students. However, we think we've laid down some very important groundwork that can be carried on by future field sites. So some future research opportunities to highlight that we think would be beneficial is to collect water level data during other seasons, during other times of the year. Obviously, we collected our data during the spring. It would also be interesting to see water level data collected during hurricane season here in North Carolina. Then another opportunity would be collecting baseline water level data for both Bowling Creek and Morgan Creek to make some important comparisons and widen our scope and see the bigger picture in the whole watershed. And then finally, to collect storm event data during more storm events. So obviously we had around 6 storm events, some more major than others. Obviously, our data would be even stronger with more storm events added to this collection. So I just want to thank everyone in attendance for their time today, and also our wonderful instructors at the Sustainable Triangle Field Site, the town of Chapel Hill, and the experts who so graciously gave us their time and advice. And now we will open it up to questions.
I have a question.
Perfect. So I think what we'll do, we've got a question in the chat. If you'd like to put questions in the chat, please go ahead and do that. It also looks like there may be an opportunity if folks want to unmute and ask questions, but we'll start off with the one in the chat and determine where to go from there. So thank you.
What do we got? Okay, so we have a question from Cindy. Did you consider property buyouts to essentially remove occupants and structures, or to provide more space for infiltration?
Thank you for your question, Sydney. Unfortunately, we did not consider that aspect when looking at green infrastructure. That's something important that you brought up, and I'm sure we can address it in the future and future field sites. So thank you.
Well, and I agree. I mean, I realize it's more of a town policy decision as opposed to a component of your capstone.
And I think Ella has additional answer.
Yeah, so we actually had a couple of seminars where our professors talked to us about property buyouts, and a lot of the time they said that property buyouts could be really good, but at the same time, a lot of times the town will just like let these properties go vacant, and a lot of times the folks that are relocated don't have anywhere to go that's as good as where they were before. So we were kind of considering the pros and cons of property buyouts, and while we didn't consider them a lot, we did just like after hearing that information, didn't want to disrupt these people living in these areas.
All right, looks like we have another one in chat.
Yes, we have a question from Kathleen, who says, how do you recommend that the town pursue educating commercial property owners about the benefits of green infrastructure, especially in areas you study?
So personally, I think, well, to go about educating people is first, I don't know, giving them any information at all, because I'm not sure town of Chapel Hill has given out any information about that. But I think the most beneficial way that we could get private property owners to implement green infrastructure on their own property is providing incentives. I know Raleigh has a program, and what is it called? It's like rainwater rewards. And so houses that do make their driveways like permeable pavement, or the sidewalks near there, actually they don't have the jurisdiction for the sidewalks, but like the pavement that they do have, that they make permeable pavement, they do get, I think, what is the
90% or 75% of the cost.
So they pay a lot less for it than they would if they were just paying it out of pocket. So I think incentive programs like that are really interesting, and I think it would be really cool if the town of Chapel Hill just thought about that a little bit. I hope that answered your question.
So I would maybe prompt you a little bit to think about information that you all generated that could be valuable in some kind of a communication campaign with business owners, just about flooding in general. Like something about your water level data.
Yeah, I think so. I did make a map with the expanded, like the predicted flood hazard zone for 100-year flood for 2040. And I think having that data accessible and maybe expanding that so it's not just the Booker Creek watershed, and then making that information publicly accessible to people who are actually going to be impacted by that is going to do a lot for them in making sure that they can avoid potential damages. And if it looks like they're going to be in those zones, maybe be like, hey, you might want to consider green stormwater infrastructure, or maybe encourage businesses in those areas to think about that, because they will eventually be impacted by those future floods.
All right, got more in the chat.
We have a question from Melanie, who says, is there any data or literature for the potential impacts of the mitigation strategies?
I'm sure there is. I'm not sure that, I don't think we generated any of that personally. I'm sure there is a resource somewhere that does that. I know the EPA has a lot of good resources on green infrastructure and green stormwater infrastructure. They have a few calculation tools, I believe, too, that are good for seeing what kind is actually worthwhile in your area and stuff like that. We just kind of did our own manual assessment, but those calculators are also really good resources. And I know there's been a good amount of case studies done. I'm pretty sure the EPA also has a big long list of links to different case studies that have been done over the years that really look at, was this green stormwater infrastructure method actually impactful? Did it do what it said it did? Did it do it to like 100% possible mitigation, or did it only do 50%? So I know you can definitely find lots of good resources on the EPA website. Yes, I think.
Future focus.
Future focus for the field study, yeah.
All right, maybe one more.
So it's just a comment from Kathleen. It says, outstanding work, all. I see lots of opportunities to share your data and analysis.
Thank
Thank
you.
And we have another question from Cindy, who asks, did you evaluate the potential effectiveness of the town's prior strategy to cut down trees in the watershed and put in holding ponds?
We were definitely aware of the Town of Chapel Hills project in right below Eastgate Shopping Center. I believe it was called the Booker Basin Park. Yes. So we actually went there and looked around. We didn't perform any analyses exactly. We sort of wanted to take our own approach to thinking about green infrastructure. And obviously, because our main focus was on the flooding that was occurring in the parking lot and the impervious surface. So while that project, could be beneficial to water that's, collecting downstream, obviously there was impacts upstream that was affecting these businesses in the shopping mall. So we wanted to focus more so, again, with our sensor network, what was coming before, again, with that early warning signal, and focus green infrastructure there before it gets to the people. And by incorporating these mitigation strategies, hopefully improving infiltration rates to overall reduce flooding, but also give warning to businesses and residents about flood events so that they can take any measures necessary to safeguard themselves and their property. But yes, thank you for your question. I hope I answered it.
We're all good. maybe do we have any in-person questions?
Yeah, if anybody would like to unmute and ask a question directly, you're welcome to. All right. Well, hearing none, thank you all very much for attending. Thank you again to the town of Chapel Hill and to folks at the university who helped us out, all the experts who came and spoke during the seminar class who made, I think, the substantive part of the capstone possible. So thank you. And we're building for a new program in the future. And I appreciate all of the 2022 group's hard work and really great projects. So
There's definitely much more potential in the future, especially with a bunch of the questions that were asked are
absolutely,
all being thought about. for the
just like
future.
science always is. Answer some questions and ask a bunch more. So thank you all again for coming, and everybody have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.